Yo, what's going on, y'all? My name is Alex, and lately I've been seeing a huge disconnect between the new generation of basketball fans and the old generation. You have the old reliable conversations of NBA players back in the day were just plumbers, and that the new generation of players are soft, and the league used to be great before everyone decided to shoot threes. Of course, there are other arguments that come about when there's such a generational gap, but all of these arguments all stem from one huge problem that comes from the old heads of the NBA community that I've seen. So let's dive into some of these old head arguments and try to debunk them, and at the end, I'll tell you the huge problem that stems from all these conversations. Before we start though, if you do end up enjoying this video, make sure to like and sub. I'm trying to get to 1,000 subs by the end of the year, so it would mean a lot. Anyways, let's get started. I first wanted to touch on old heads saying that the league is worse because of all the three-point shooting that has happened in probably the past 5 years, and I will actually agree with them to a certain extent. There are times where games can just become three-point shooting contests, and I can see why old heads may not enjoy watching that style of basketball because I feel the same way during those moments. But where I draw the line is where old heads decide to say that players shooting all those threes have imbalanced the game, and that's why the older era is better than today, and that's where I completely disagree. Firstly, the game of basketball has never been a balanced game. The NBA used to primarily be played in the post, and three-point shooting was a rarity. Even when you think about the different eras and if one was more offensive or defensive oriented, you will see that that has always changed as well. Majority of the highest scoring teams in NBA history come from the 60s and 70s, where the pace was at an all-time high, not the current generation, and the defensive era didn't really hit its peak until the early 2000s, but it was there during the 90s. Rule changes are often not brought up enough to explain why a certain era may not be balanced as well. An example of some rule changes that were made to make the game more enjoyable to watch because of those imbalances is the Mikan rule. This rule was implemented when George Mikan was playing, and it widened the lane, the area below the basket where players can only spend 3 seconds, we all know this, but they moved it from 6 to 12 feet. This is the first time the NBA changed the rule to slow down a dominant big man from just sitting under the basket, and they had to make it even bigger once Wilt Chamberlain showed up. There's even the 5-second back to the basket rule that was made to stop players like Charles Barkley from using their entire shot clock to post someone up to get a shot under the basket. And no, they weren't just doing it to stop one guy. Once the entire league started copying it, because it was working obviously, the NBA had to stop it because it wasn't fun to watch because it was tedious and repetitive. So no, it's not like the NBA was balanced back in the day. Things have always fluctuated, and a big reason for that is pace and also the rules that were implemented, and that's the way the game is played now. If the NBA wants to be more balanced, I think it would definitely have to implement rules for defenses, and I definitely think that is necessary, but to act like back in the day in the 80s and 90s that the game was balanced, it's just not true. Next up, let's go listen to a conversation over at the Player's Choice channel, which I love to listen to all the time, and I think you guys should as well. And they're talking about John Stockton and why John Stockton can't be a top 10 playmaker of all time.
As a passer, the top 5 passers can make that. So at minimum, he's in the argument to be a top 5 passer. His ability to get to the basket and score and beat up on other players. He's also one of the better playmakers. So how is he not a top 10 playmaker?
I'm not going to deep dive into a bunch of clips and dissect every single one of his passes, at least in this particular video. It may be something I do during the offseason, but I will put some clips in the background from his career high 28 assist game so you can watch and listen to what I'm about to say. When you go back and watch highlights of Stockton, please realize that majority of the time, Stockton wasn't creating any sort of advantages for his teammates to put them in a better or easier situation to score. He was mostly just dumping the ball down to Karl Malone or Mark Eaton, or he was sitting at the top of the key, waiting for a play to develop and passing to wings coming off of screens. And when I say look at the highlights, I don't mean the compilation videos of all of his best passes, because we can do that for every single player. I want you to watch single game highlights. There's plenty of them on YouTube. Those highlights give much better insight into what was actually happening in a normal game and how Stockton was normally getting his assists. I also want to make it clear that I'm not saying there aren't examples of him driving in the lane and kicking it out to a shooter or even making a difficult pass to an open player, but what I am saying is that it isn't as much as you would think based on conversations around Stockton and what people who were alive to see Stockton are actually saying about him. And the last take we're going to look at is from our good friend Mad Dog from First Take, and he's going to talk about Larry Bird's three-point shooting and the physicality back then compared to now.
There's plenty of people that have shot more, made more, and guess what? made more at a higher percentage than Larry Bird from three. I'm not saying Larry Bird is not one of the greatest shooters ever. He's not one of the greatest three-point shooters ever.
Yes,
you cannot make that argument.
Yes,
I'm sorry.
Because the 80s is so much different. There's physicality, the way they guarded people. You couldn't.
Can we get
I've been trying to make a point.
JJ Redick is heated at Mad Dog, and I honestly don't blame him. On the screen are clips of Larry Bird and Steph Curry's threes, and what you're going to see is that Bird's threes, while having some good contest, he is actually left open a lot of the time, and there isn't much resistance at all from the defense. Curry, on the other hand, this dude gets guarded as soon as he crosses half court, and he almost always has to fight over screens to get open, and that's part of what makes him one of the best three-point shooters ever. A big part of this has to do with the era, which I get, but because of that, it should be implied even if you are a good three-point shooter. Back in the 80s, they would rather you shoot from three than get an easy two. But Mad Dog is talking about the physicality of the 80s, and that's why Bird is one of the best three-point shooters ever. These clips should prove otherwise, that if there was physicality, it wasn't past the three-point line, so his point is invalid. This isn't the only stupid thing he said though in this clip. He's about to point out the biggest problem with old head logic.
You and I are going to sit down. We're going to sit there and we're going to watch finals games from the 1980s.
Well, Jay, here's the difference.
I'm going to show you what physical basketball is versus physical fouling.
You're watching them on YouTube. I saw the games. I watched the games at the time. I watched all these games. You didn't watch. You weren't alive when these games were being played. Did you see Bird play against the Lakers in '84? Did you see Bird against the Rockets in '86? Were you at courtside watching these games? No. You got to watch the games at the time. Okay. Watching them on YouTube 40 years later is not the same at the moment.
The idea that someone's take is invalid because they weren't alive or born to see it live, and that even if they did look at the highlights years later, it doesn't matter because they're missing a bunch of context, it's just utterly ridiculous. Let me ask you guys a question. Do you remember what happened at your 10th birthday party? Because you were there, so you should be able to tell me everything that happened. The answer is no, right? I would hope so, unless you're like 10, 15 years old, which would make more sense, but I'm assuming you're probably at least 20 years old. The reason why you probably don't remember every single detail is because you aren't actively trying to remember what's happening, and you're just living in the moment. If something traumatic happens to you, like let's say you saw someone get robbed, and after a couple days an investigator asks you to relive the situation and recount what you saw, you probably won't remember everything that happened because you aren't actively trying to remember everything because you're in shock. So in this case, for watching Larry Bird, I find it impossible to believe that Mad Dog remembers everything that happened in the 80s over 40 years ago, and in a specific Celtics versus Lakers game in 1984 to be able to debate about this. Especially with someone like JJ Redick, who is offering to show clips because you can tell he has more recently looked back to recall what happened. To even go back on the John Stockton take, even if you were alive to see Stockton and see how good of a passer he was, I think he was a good passer, a great passer at that, but in terms of playmaking, if you are watching him live, I highly doubt you are looking at him with the critical lens compared to now when we can just go back and actually be more critical. And even if you did see his games, the chances are you probably aren't seeing majority of his games because one, you don't live in Utah, so the logic of being able to remember exactly what you saw live and being there at the games, it just wouldn't work because again, that was over 30 to 40 years ago. So you're trying to tell me that you can remember every single pass that John Stockton made. I just highly doubt that. Would you rather listen and believe someone who is recalling what happened 40 years ago, but hasn't gone back to see and make sure that he is correct? Or would you rather listen and believe someone who is recalling what happened 40 years ago and has actually done their job and went back to make sure that they were correct? I would hope it's the latter part. If there's something I would want you guys to take away from this video and to just take away from how stupid this old head logic can be, is to just do your own research. Just because someone like Mad Dog, who has been in the media for a long time and was alive enough to see those games happen, doesn't mean everything he is saying is gospel. Do your own research, double check, refresh your memory, and always make sure that your takes are based on facts and not a memory that you only recounted once. Well, those are my thoughts on some old head narratives. Let me know down below what y'all think. If you enjoyed, make sure to like and sub. Check out my socials down below in the description. You can also check out this video somewhere on the screen where I go over some overrated players this NBA season. Anyway, see you on the next one. Peace out.